Hello and welcome to the April 3rd edition of the Bubb Report. Last week, the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court finally dealt a body blow to one of the more controversial legacies of the Grenada Revolution. People's Law No. 24 of 1983, enacted in the absence of a functioning parliament in the country and a mere 1 month and 3 days before the violent demise of the People's Revolutionary Government, declared that any person who is appointed to a post in the service of the government of Grenada on or after April 3rd, 1983, shall not be entitled to any pension, gratuity, or other allowance under any of the scheduled enactments. High Court Judge Ralston Glasgow, in his written judgment, advanced the view that, quote, the PDA is void to the extent that it is inconsistent with the rights set out in Section 92, subsection 2 of the Constitution. Ewart Lane, a former member of the People's Revolutionary Government, advanced that the PDA was intended to be a temporary measure which sought to establish a cutoff point between the constitutionally entrenched old system of non-contributory pensions under the 1958 Pensions Act and the new system of contributory pensions under the National Insurance Scheme. Representatives of the plaintiff and the defendants reacted to the ruling last week, with the state doing some damage control amidst reporting, which we have not been able to validate, that signaled their intention to appeal the ruling.
The only firm decision the government has taken in the 24 hours since the ruling is to declare its intention to invite the trade unions to have a discussion on the latest developments. As it has been, especially since 2018, the government not only stands for open dialogue, but has initiated it on many occasions as part of its consultative approach on matters of national interest.
Declare the Pension Disqualification Act unconstitutional and reject our motion. We will fall full judgment upon this issue. Regards, J. A. L. Bristol, QC.
Justice Glasgow, in his ruling, agreed with plaintiff Irvin Mcqueen. The latter brought litigation against the state of Grenada in 1997 in a matter that offered analogous arguments with the current case. In a fit of irony, the initial case was dismissed by the same court that Glasgow currently presides over. When litigated before the Court of Appeal in the same year, former Acting Chief Justice Dennis Byron declared that the Pension Disqualification Act was void to the extent that it is inconsistent with the benefits created by Section 884-8 of the Constitution. The March 2022 ruling also agreed with this previous decision and puts to rest the gray area that the National Insurance Act did not modify or repeal the pension scheme for public officers contained under the pensions regulations. Additionally, Mcqueen made the point that, quote, I so find that the PDA was clearly inadequate in its efforts to remove the rights of the public workers to receive a pension under the pensions legislation, unquote. The judge also ruled that the amendments to the Pension Act, No. 5 of 2018, was unconstitutional, null and void. This 2018 Act was amended in Section 18, subsection 2, by deleting the words before the 4th of April 1983 and substituting them with before the 22nd of February 1985. The implication of this ruling is significant, given the estimated $1 billion EC price tag of this payout to retired and currently serving unionized public officers. For context, Grenada's annual gross domestic product is 2.8 billion EC dollars, with a public debt of just over 2.06 billion EC dollars for 2021. Although there was a slight dip in the country's debt to GDP ratio, its debt to GDP ratio remains at 68.9% of its annual gross domestic product. This week on our program, we will examine the impacts and implications of this ruling with a team of experts who have intimate knowledge of this issue. Also on the report, we will reflect on the legacy of the mythical and legendary anti-slavery crusader Julien Freon, who led an unsuccessful but fierce rebellion against the oppressive British occupation of Grenada in the late 18th century. Fedon, who was of mixed European and African ancestry, was successful in naming Guave the capital of Grenada during the Revolution, calling it Port Libre, or Free Port, where he established an interim government. In his new book titled Julien Freon, Revolutionary, Patriot and Insurrectionist, Grenadian author Herman Hall attempts to reframe this anti-slavery crusader as a Grenadian national hero who valiantly ushered Grenada's first revolution into existence and into the history books. We welcome our guests, attorney Ruggles Ferguson, actuary Chantel Maguire, trade unionist Kenny James, and publisher of the Grenadian American Everybody's Magazine, Herman Hall. We thank you for joining us. Contemporary soca music, the quintessentially eclectic and syncretic genre of music, would not reach its heights without the skillful musical craftsmanship of the late Dexter Blacks Stewart. Blacks' quirky, melodic, and uplifting soca hits tapped into the spirit of a Caribbean culture that offered full-time soca lovers and carnival revelers a rush of euphoria at major carnival events. Blacks, who commanded the spotlight as the lead singer of the legendary soca band Roy Cape and All Stars, produced some chart-topping hits, including Lego, Hulk, Tusty, Mashup, Carnival Jumbie, Rankin Ting, Wine in Practice, Gal Owner, and Carnival Jumbie. This musical shortlist merely scratches the surface of his extensive discography. Despite his innovative and bold contribution to the culture, Blacks was grossly underrated by an industry that cared less about the richness of his musical talent and more about his looks. Blacks himself lamented the ugly truth of respectability politics, colorism, and classism in a social media posting earlier this year.
They were told I'm too black, I'm too black. Makeup don't like me, camera don't like me, my belly too big, too fat, not marketable enough. But thank God for my mom that teach her sons how to overcome these obstacles.
Blacks leaves a ubiquitous and beloved presence on the beautiful mosaic of soca and the arts, despite the barriers he confronted. His contribution impacted the Caribbean and beyond through his characteristic style, infectious and grounded presence, and musical versatility. This joyful artist, a late bloomer to the soca arena, left earlier than expected, but brought immense joy to his adoring fans and left a lasting musical legacy with the highest esteem. The great Maya Angelou opined that if you are going to live, make sure you leave a legacy. Make a mark on the world that can't be erased. Blacks' music is forever etched into contemporary Caribbean history, and for that, we should all be grateful. May he rest in peace, and may his music bring us forever joy. A pleasant good morning again to all our viewers and listeners. And at this time, I wish to welcome our first guest for the Bubb Report on this wonderful Sunday, Mr. Herman Hall, who is the publisher of the Everybody's Magazine. Of many years, Everybody's Magazine is a Grenadian American institution. And so we're happy to welcome him here. Mr. Hall, welcome to the report.
Yeah, good morning, and good morning to all your listeners around the world.
Absolutely. First, let me extend my deepest condolences to you and your family on the passing of your brother in England. Now, Mr. Hall, your recent book attempts to cast Julien Freon in a different light. What was missing in the literature, in your view, that you felt you attempted to address in your current publication?
Well, basically what has been missing over the years, and we'll go back to that, our great African writer, and you know who I'm referring to, who once said that the lions never live to tell their tale. You know, the hunters go, they kill the lion, but the poor lion is dead, so the poor lion cannot tell the story. And this is exactly what happened in the Grenada Rebellion, or the Fedon's Rebellion, or Fedon's Revolution, is that we never really heard this side from the Fedon's perspective, because everything was given to us from basically the scholars, the researchers. They all dwell into the archives in Britain. So everything was written from a British perspective. Even the war itself. I mean, Fedon could have lost that war within 3 days, but there was a lot of British mistakes in the first 72 hours of the rebellion. Yet we do not hear about those things from the British perspective. So essentially, one can look at the Fedon's rebellion, and as well as Julien Freon himself, as a patriot if you are looking at it from the French perspective, or you can look at him as an insurrectionist, someone who insurrected against the King of England.
That is a very interesting perspective. Now, talk to us about the way that history portrays Fedon. Do you believe that history portrayed him fairly? Now, notwithstanding that there are several Grenadian historians who actually also studied Fedon. So did they also portray him within the context of a colonial lens?
Well, yes, most of them, because again, they were limited. There was not, science was not that progressive as today. They had limited resources. So they basically presented it from a British perspective. Moreover, very few Grenadian and scholars worldwide who has written about Fedon. As a matter of fact, there are more people outside of Grenada who has written about Fedon than Grenadian authors. But most of them only had a chapter or two in the book. So for example, former Prime Minister George Brison, whose book My Company sold, and Dr. Beverly Still book, whose book My Company also sold here in the United States. They gave like a chapter or two. So I think that I'm basically the first person who actually wrote two books entirely dedicated to Julien Freon. The first book was called Belvedere Estate, Fedon's House, and now this new book. So I was able to expand on what these authors may have said. But again, I am also looking at it. I was born on the estate. I learned my ABC in Fedon's house. I learned to count from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 in Fedon's house. So if you ask me, one of my first memories when I was maybe a toddler, 3, 4, 5 years old, was Julien Freon. At that age, I thought the man was still alive but just recently died on Belvedere Estate, because the laborers always spoke of Julien Freon. So essentially, I have been studying Julien Freon ever since I could remember anything in my life.
Mhm. Now, you indicated that you are not a historian. You made that very clear in the book, and so I do have a copy of the book here, by the way, and
Okay.
I'm actually right now in the chapter 20 of the book, actually, British blunders, Fedon's ingenuity. That's where I am now. So,
Okay.
but in my reading of the book, you indicated that you're not a historian. So the question is, why was there a need to make that disclosure?
Well, again, I'm looking at it from a Caribbean perspective, especially from a Grenadian perspective. If you do not have a PhD or a BA or bachelor's in history or something like that, or if you're not a professor of history, then you couldn't be considered a historian. Again, I'm a journalist in that sense, so I'm not writing. This book is. I'm not writing for an academic audience. I'm writing for a grassroots readership. We call it in New York City a subway reader, meaning you can read something in a book from one train stop to the next and relate to it. It's not an intricate book. So this is why I use the word I'm not a historian, because most of the colonial historians I'm talking about in the Caribbean, they have written scholarly books that is like the preacher preaching to the choir, that nobody really could understand those books. So I attempted. This is why the first book, published in 2016, is still selling today. As a matter of fact, you will be amazed to know the amount of tourists who bought the book at Morris Bishop Airport and wrote letters. Some even went back to Grenada. They claimed they were going back to Grenada. These were tourists because they were so impressed with how I described the mountains, the landscape, and so forth. So in that sense, I mean, when I went to Grenada history, I got my distinction in history in the GC. And when I taught at the St. John's Christian Secondary School, I taught history for my 2-year stint. The first play ever written on Grenada about Julien Freon, was I wrote a play, and it was produced at the St. John's Christian Secondary School in 1965. And since you are talking about that, I would like to let the audience know that in 1967, March 1st through the 3rd, 1967, when our nation, Grenada, got statehood, the last step towards independence, I wrote a large piece about Julien Freon in the West Indian newspaper at that time. It was called The West Indian by the late T.A. Marichaud, but Mr. Klein then was the editor. So I have been writing and studying Freon. Moreover, as I said, I was born, raised, grew up on that estate until I left Grenada. Moreover, I have been to Freon's camp maybe over 100 times or more.
That is a record. I'm sure you're probably competing with Telfer Bideau, who also.
Well, first of all, Telfer we are cousins. I spent when I was like 6, 7, 8 years old, I would spend my holiday in Soubise, and Telfer should be about 6 or 7 years older than me, or even maybe a little more. So Telfer is dedicated to Telfer, a great Grenada hiker, my cousin. But most important, the book is dedicated to Father Divas. Now, I knew Father Divas in 2 contexts. When I was a toddler, as I said, the priest came to Belvedere, because you walk from Grenville to Bob, I guess, in the 50s and so forth. And I remember reading his book. And when I became of age, meaning I'm a young teenager, Father Divas and myself used to argue, because I used to be telling Father Divas, listen, there must be information in Grenada about Freon. And he was saying, no, everything you need to know about Freon is in the book. But lo and behold, people like Dr. Beverly Steele and Dr. Curtis Jacobs, they found tons of documents, which is still rotting, you can say, in the Grenada Registrar's office. I felt that way. I had that hunch since I was a teenager that there must be documents there. So I remember the governor of Grenada at that time, Talbot, he came to see the play at the St. John's Christian Secondary School, because it was basically the first local play about a Grenadian person performed in a secondary school. We have to remember that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, what we call speech night It had to be about a European play, primarily Chaucer or Shakespeare. So in that sense, I've been studying Fedon, as I said, all my life.
And now I'm sure that the people of Guav would be happy to learn that the city that never sleeps during Fedon's zenith was actually the capital of Grenada.
Yes, well,
Ton's
yes.
viewers, please go easy. What role does Guav play in Fedon's story?
Well, actually, it started in Guav and in La Baye, not the present town where Grenville is. When I was growing up, the old folks called it La Baye. But La Baye in Fedon's time was near Marquis, near Subi's Junction. This was the original town in Fedon's time. And the revolution or the rebellion started simultaneously in Guav and in La Baye. Fedon himself led the rebellion from La Baye on midnight March 2nd, 1795. But Guav it was in Guav, Governor Ninian Home was captured. And Guav was basically all the ships. This is where basically Sir Ralph Abercrombie landed when he went to Belvedere to end the rebellion. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers came through Guav. You have to remember, these were all the ports. It took the British, we have to remember, thousands of sailors and Marines to end that rebellion. And in the end, it was not even the British who actually got rid of Fedon. It was British hired hands. You could call them commandos. They were Dutch and German commandos. So Guav played a very important role. But when we have to remember again that Julien Freon was in control of all the parishes in Grenada, including the parish of St. George. The only thing Julien Freon did not capture was the tongue of St. George's. But he was also in control of the entire parish of St. George. So Guav was basically the capital of Grenada, since Fedon could not have captured the tongue of St. George's. And when we say Guav, I'm talking about Montgramby, Mount Nesbitt, and Douglaston.
Okay. Now, one of the beautiful aspects of the Fedon story, to me at least, was the fact that he was never captured. He never gave the colonizers the satisfaction of capturing him and torturing him and stringing him up at a public square, perhaps at the market square. I know what they did to our ancestors back then in that context, and so Fedon did not give the colonizers that satisfaction. And that to me is one of the most beautiful stories of Julien Freon. That we don't even know what contemporary accounts, at least back then, had no idea what he looked like because no one really documented that. And I believe that remains one of the legends of the man himself. Your thoughts?
Right, yeah, exactly. This is why, as I said, there was no portrait, no nothing of Julien Freon. In the cover of the book, I try to, this is my concept, working with the magazine designer, everybody's magazine designer, of my concept of Fedon. And I should, since you mentioned that, the three persons on the cover, Julien Freon on a horse, the person with Fedon, the black guy, he's not a slave. He is a maroon. And without the maroons, Fedon would not have succeeded. And the man behind Julien Freon is a white Frenchman in Grenada, because there was a large French population. This was the cause of the Fedon's rebellion in the first place. They were searching for French rights. So the concept of Fedon, we did not know his color, but his father was 100% white. His father left Bordeaux, France in July of 1749. And he married a lady in Martinique, and she was a mulatto. So if she was a mulatto, it means that she had some white blood in her. So my portrait of Julien Freon is how he would have looked in 1795. I think the shot that is seen around the world, I think it was developed during the Morris Bishop government, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe that artist may have seen it as how Fedon would have looked in the modern day, in the 20th century or in the first century. Whereas what I have attempted to do on the cover of the book is how Fedon would have looked as a Frenchman. And if you read what happened, they practiced great what we will call today public relations and marketing stunt. On March 2nd or March 3rd, 1795, the morning after, they wore all sorts of colors from the French, whatever they could get to make themselves look very, very important. That was a way of telling the French population, you better join us. And on the other hand, they were telling the folks that the French have landed. Of course, the French did not land in Grenada. It was something that it was great, just public relations. So what I attempted to do also in the book was not to, I try not to be a revisionist, because a lot of, you mentioned about the mystique of Fedon before. The first play about Julien Freon, or the first novel about Julien Freon, was written in 1838. So a novel is basically not a true fact. You could have historical novels which are extremely good. So, but in a novel, the story of Fedon, the legends of Fedon has already been passed on from generation to generation, primarily from a British perspective. But again, as technology improves, when you look at the French archives and when you match the actual landmarks in Belvedere and in the other places, you will find that you have to revise, not necessarily rewrite. And what I attempted to do in the book was not to give my ideas. And if I gave my ideas, I would say, well, this is what I thought. But for example, I never said in this book that Fedon was born in Grenada. You may read it on some websites, or you may read by some other writers. Some say he was born in Martinique. Others say he was born in Victoria. Others say he was born in Grand, as it was then called. But I do not know. Show me the evidence. As the lawyers would say, present me the evidence. We still have to find documents relating to Fedon's birth certificate. As a matter of fact, he may have been born in another island, because we know his father arrived in Martinique most likely by September 1749. And then the next time we heard of his father, Pierre Fedon, was a tax record in 1763 in Grenada. So what happened between 1749 and 1763? That whole portion is missing. So some historians use logic. Others say he was born here, others say he was born there. I am not saying that at all in the book. I am challenging tomorrow's researchers to continue where I have basically left off.
Yeah, and I think and you make a very important point there. And wearing my researcher's hat, I think it's also important for historians and for future people who want to document Fedon's history, not only to consult with the current historians that have who have extensively done this research, but to also go into the French archives. I think, especially in the context of Fedon, if we want to really talk about an origin story, going to the French archives would be as critical in documenting that. What are your thoughts on that idea?
Well, yes. Well, you use the French archives. I would prefer to say even the Grenada archives, what we call the Grenada Registrar's Office. Now, I would not advise anyone to go there, because to get the hundreds of year old documents, for the simple reason it's like ice. The ice is going to melt. As soon as you touch it, the paper is going to disintegrate. What I would love to see any government of Grenada in the future do, perhaps hire Israel or one of those countries where I think they have science of progress to that extent that they could actually shoot the documents or the folders. They are just bundled and thrown in the registrar's office without touching it. So, for example, my last visit to the registrar's office was January 2020, And anything I touch there in 2020 would not may have just disintegrated. So anything like, for example, Professor Curtis Jacobs did, I did not touch it, because I know if I touch it, another generation of researchers will not be able to find it. I think the best solution, so although I'm saying it is there, I am also saying, please do not run to the registrar's office. In any event, they will only allow people who are studying those documents to interfere with it. And even them, it has to be, any government in Grenada should really deal with one of those foreign embassies, especially Israel, who has really made some with the scrolls, the deep sea scrolls, I think they are called. And but there's a lot of information, and then a lot of the information is written in French, 18th century French. So again, there's a lot of information about Julien Freon that we really do not know, but it's just been handed down, as I said before. This is why I call it an untold story, because what we have been told was from British excuses. Again, what we have to remember, that the Fedon's rebellion was an international revolution. I mean, it was all over the United States in the certain colony. Well, then they had already become independent. But in all the newspapers in Europe, in today's world, in the 21st century, that would have been global news. And the Fedon's rebellion only occurred 20 years after Britain lost the 13 colonies. So under no circumstances Britain could have lost Grenada. So again, looking at it, one has to look at it in a broad perspective. And as you said in one of the chapters, there were many, many mistakes. And it all started with Governor Home. Perhaps the man who did the most destruction to Grenada and caused the Fedon's rebellion was ironically the person that Fedon murdered, the 47 or 48 prisoners. Governor Home was always anti-French, anti-Roman Catholic, and one of the biggest thieves in Grenada in terms of taking lands from the French, although in a sense he bought it legally. So Governor Home had owned perhaps most of what we call Grand Port of Victoria, where the diamond estate, all the way the present chocolate factories, all those things were owned by Governor Home. The interesting thing about it, this is just my opinion, but those documents remain in the Grenada Registrar's office, where you can see all the deeds, how Governor Home was able to take the lands from the French. So for example, the British said nobody should own more than 500 acres of land in Grenada, whether you are French or British. So what Governor Home and the British simply did, they will buy patches of land and then gradually merge them so they will own much more than 500 acres of land. So again, the Fedon's rebellion, in summarizing, is really an untold story. I try to give it from things that we really did not know about. And the scholars scholars are people doing their PhD, they are trying to prove some thesis or the other. I wasn't trying to prove any thesis, so I was just writing the story of Julien Freon, which I hope that anyone, you don't have to be educated, you could be driving the bus from Victoria to Tongue or from Grenville to St. George's or wherever, and you could casually read Julien Freon, revolutionary, patriot, and insurrectionist. I'm not hearing you.
Well, can you hear me now? Yes. This was really a very educational talk. I just want to get some comments here. One question is asking, Mr. Hall, I recently visited a place called Bois Negre in Concord. What is the relation to Fedon and also Manquaqua?
Well, again, all of these places were tracts created by emancipated slaves or runaway slaves, what we commonly call maroon. But again, Concord is right, in a sense, below Fedon's camp. he wants to know the geography of Grenada. It's just a big, long ridge that extends. So I have gone from Concord, Grand Roy, Marigot, Beaujeu, all those roads heads to Fedon's camp. So there is that relation. As a matter of fact, this is why these were some of the places Fedon and his rebels, they hid in those places and fought against the British after the French surrendered. One has to remember that the French, who was obviously the French from Guadeloupe, who was supporting Julien Freon, they surrendered to the British when they realized that there is no way they could defeat this massive thousands of Britishers. They surrendered, but Julien Freon did not surrender. He did not surrender. He continued fighting. But let's be factual and let's do not make Julien Freon a person who did not make any mistakes. He did surrender, but the British refused it. He said he's going to surrender if they will give him a safe passage to Guadeloupe. Simple as that. He will surrender if they will give him a safe passage to Guadeloupe. And the British authorities, they all said, no way, they want him. And this is why they gave £500 sterling. Do you know what was £500 sterling at that time? You could have bought an entire estate. And yet no one could have caught up with Julien Freon. I also would like to say that since you had mentioned my brother's passing, I'll be in London. I'm leaving for London on Friday, and I'll be in London for about 14 days. So any one of your viewers in London who wish to contact me could just email me, herman@everybodiesmag.com, which is herman@everybodiesmag.com. The book is already on sale in London. Ironically, you were speaking about the broad scope of Fedon. The first sales of this new book, ironically, came out of Australia. And there is, in the book also, I try to give a broader scope, just not restrict the book to Julien Freon, but show the relation. For example, how many of us in Grenada know that one of the major battles in the American Revolution or the American War of Independence was fought off Grenada on July 4 to 6, 1779? That was a major factor in the American Revolution. The Simoon Estate, which was really called Simon, it was then changed to Simoon. Simoon Estate, there is a book written by a professor. She wrote this book about the Carys of Boston. Now, the Carys of Boston, they went to Grenada. They had owned Mount Pleasant Estate in Victoria or St. Mark's, and they had 13 children. 9 of them were born in Grenada, and one of the grandchildren created Radcliffe University, which is one of the major schools or universities or colleges for women in the United States. They played a very important role in the Fedon's rebellion, not with Fedon, but against Fedon. So there is a lot we could learn about the Fedon's rebellion as opposed to say he killed the governor. I mean,
Mr. Hall, we are almost out of time, but on the question of killing a governor, at that time, I have my own thoughts. Shall we call it collateral damage then in war?
I would not say it was collateral damage. I would not say that, but in the 10 seconds we have, the question we have to ask ourselves, which is in the book, did the British in Grenada, President Mackenzie, who took over once Ninian Home was a prisoner, did he really want to save Julien Freon? Did the British leadership in Grenada want, not save Julien Freon, sorry, I meant Ninian Home governor. Did they want to save Governor Ninian Home? So the question is, Mackenzie, who led the fight for the British, okay, he succeeded The governor is in prison. Not once did he say, I am trying to rescue Governor Ninian Home. It was always about rescuing the country, rescuing the colony, as he said. So the question is, we tend to blame Julien Freon, as the British try to do, for everything. But the question we have to ask ourselves, did Governor Ninian Home, political rivals in St. George's who ran Grenada, did they really want to see Ninian Home killed by Julien Freon? That's a question one has to
Right. But again, I think we also have to understand the context of the rebellion, right? The context of the rebellion certainly was political, but there was also sort of a human rights component to this. We have to remember that our people were enslaved in Grenada at the time. So
Yeah,
I believe Fedon, like his compatriots in Haiti, were rebelling against an oppressive system that really enslaved our people and subjugated our ancestors.
well, correct. But and then again, the British did as much damage to the slaves, to the enslaved, and to the French as in other words, they did just the same amount of wickedness. They did not even try you. And this is one of the problem with the Federalist Rebellion. The British was so concerned in trying to show the French citizenry and the enslaved who is boss. So as soon as they caught you, they hang you within a day or two. It was nothing more than a kangaroo court. So in other words, they had, for example, Jack Shadow. They captured him about 8 or 10 years later, and Joachim Philip. But rather than keeping them and questioning them, where have they been, what happened, they were just intent to show an example to others, do not try another rebellion. So they killed them. So the British was just as horrible against the slaves and the citizenry of Grenada as Fedon. So accusing Fedon of being this murderer, you could accuse the British of just being worse. They were even worse. When they found you and they hung you in the market square, shot you, that was not enough. They dragged you around the market, around well, there were no streets, One of them they hanged on in Sherry Hill, what we call Sherry Hill, just above Queen's Park, for the birds to eat his flesh. So if you look at evilness and what happened, it happened on both sides.
Mr. Hall, thank you so much. This was such an enlightening session. We also would want to invite Mr. Anthony Wendell DeRiggs to the Bubb Report on a subsequent broadcast, because he also published a recent book, and I believe Grenadian authors ought to be celebrated. And as one viewer commented last week, Grenada is experiencing a renaissance. So if you do have a recent book that was published that reflects anything Grenadian, please contact us on the Bubb Report, and we would love to feature the book. So, Mr. Hall, thank you again for your appearing on the Bubb Report.
Thank you so much, and I will love and congratulations on your show. It's a very, very good show, and I enjoy it very much.
Absolutely, Mr. Hall. Thank you so much. Viewers and listeners, stay with us. We will be right back.
No government in the last 30 years has attempted to deal with this problem. This is the first government. And this is the first government that has agreed on pension. The issue is not pension anymore, The issue is advance payment to the pension that we have all agreed to.
Seeking to find is a pathway, a solution in terms of having a pension for public. Under the NIS Act, sections 46, I believe 47, government it provided for government to have had an additional pension, something different for public officers, because it's true that what the NIS provides is not comparable to what we were getting in our time, because we got our NIS and we got a state pension. And so I believe what government is seeking to do is to give effect to that sections 46 and 47. And we ask the unions to the table. Let us discuss as we have been accustomed to, and let us find that solution. Staying away is not the answer. And as I said, what we need now are some creative thinkers. What it is that we can do, what it is that we can agree on. So if somebody dies before 12.5 years, what it is that you could ask government to put in place so that the estate can have a little something. We are asking them.
Viewers and listeners, we wish to welcome you back for the panel segment of the week here on the Bubb Report. As a programming note, in the interest of balance, the Bubb Report always attempts to obtain viewpoints from the other side of any story. Because the truth is, journalistically speaking, every story has three sides: your side, my side, and the truth. In the context of the next segment, we did reach out to the government of Grenada, as it is our intention to do whenever these matters arise. We did speak with the Honorable Oliver Joseph, who then directed us to the Minister of Labour, the Honorable Peter David. Mr. Joseph declined to appear on the program, indicating that Mr. David would better be able to speak on this issue. We did reach out to Mr. David, and Mr. David indicated that he would not be available, citing that he's away on government business. We also attempted to reach out to other government officials, but no responses were forthcoming. I'm saying all of this to say that we did attempt to reach the person who would have been best placed to speak on this, and that's the Honorable Peter David. But the floor is open, and Mr. David is always open and always receptive to appearing on the Bubb Report, and we believe that he would appear on a subsequent Bubb Report episode to offer the government's take on this issue. And at this time, I wish to welcome our guest for this segment, Mr. Kenny James, who is a former executive member of the Grenada Union of Teachers. I almost said the Grenada United Labour Party there. Mr. James is here in his private capacity as a tradesman, and so you're not representing any of the unions who are involved in this litigation. That point needs to be made very clear. Mr. Ruggles Fergus, who was one of the attorneys in the litigation, on behalf of the three trade union organizations that brought this case before the court. And Ms. Chantal McGuire, I wish Ms. McGuire would turn her camera on. Ms. Chantal McGuire, who is an actuary, and she would be able to provide sort of the financial implications of this particular ruling. But I want to begin with you, Ruggles. Now, Ruggles, last week, the government of Grenada indicated that reporting by the Grenada Today, which we are unable to confirm, and the Grenada Today essentially made the point that the attorneys there allegedly attempted that indicated an intention to appeal. Was that contemporary account also an account that you're aware of?
No, well, first of all, good morning, Kellon, and good morning, listeners and viewers. And if you allow me 30 seconds to just commend Mr. Hall, I had the pleasure of hearing part of his program on his, efforts to ensure that our history, as best as possible, is accurately written and reflected from our perspective. So just let me quickly make that point. On the issue of the appeal, none of the attorneys who actually, well, certainly neither Mr. Bristol, Mr. Hood, or myself were present at the reading of the actual judgment. So I'm not too sure what was said there. What I do know, however, is that whatever is said there, because you're not seeking leave to appeal, where you might, after a judgment, you might apply before the judge, then and there for leave to appeal. If a party in a decision as this, which is a final High Court decision, a party has 42 days to appeal. The party does not require leave to appeal. It's an automatic right of appeal. So if a party wishes to appeal, then they have 42 days to do so. So I'm not too sure. I've heard different versions of it, but I cannot attest to what was actually said during the reading of the judgment.
Okay, but during the reading, I'm just trying to understand, during the reading of a judgment, can whoever the litigants are, the attorneys for the litigants, can they make a claim or indicate that they want to appeal there and then? Is that how it works?
Well, you can, and that's what I'm saying. It really makes no difference. Sometimes certain decisions, for example, in order to appeal, you require the leave or permission of the court. So if you require leave or permission of the court, you may then and there at the reading of the judgment apply for leave to appeal, do an oral application then and there. Most times it's done in the form of a written application, but if the other side does not object, most times the court can grant it there and there, then and there. However, when it's a final judgment, you may say that, but it makes no difference really whether or not you say it then and there, because there is an automatic right to appeal within a 42-day period. And whatever you say on that day does not affect that right to appeal. So I'm saying it's neither really here nor there. I cannot attest to what was said, but whatever was said, there was a version after and debate as to what was really said. But from a legal standpoint, what was said then and there is really immaterial. Because if the other side wishes to appeal, then they have that right to appeal within a 42-day period. They do not require the leave of the court.
Okay, so I'm glad you made that point, and I think that point needs to be made. And so, Ruggles, let us then talk about the need for this case, because in my reading, in my research for the program today, I was reading on the Mcqueen judgment. Now, the Mcqueen judgment was also adjudicated before this court, and Mcqueen won at the appellate stage, right? She did appeal, yes? And so I'm trying to understand, if Mcqueen won at the appellate stage, why was that appeal not upheld by the state?
Okay. Well, important question, Kellon, and it gives me the opportunity actually to start exactly where I wish to start.
Yeah.
Because there are three main cases coming from Grenada that touches and concerns pensions. The first one was Donovan, that's Donovan and the AG, and that concerned the Public Service Reorganization Act of 1987, when there was the massive retrenchment within the public service. And it was then touted, and that was under the Blaze administration, that public workers will get what was referred to then as a golden handshake. And in other words, your pension at the time would depend on how long you worked in the service. And Donovan challenged it through then Queen's Counsel Derek Knight, who represented him. And he challenged it, saying, listen, the Public Service Reorganization Act 1987 is unconstitutional, because what determines how I get paid in a retrenchment is 84.8 of the Constitution. And what does 84.8 says? To put it simply, if you are retrenched or sent home for the purposes of reorganization of the public service, then you ought to be paid as if you had attained the age of 60 years. In other words, however long you worked in the service, for those reasons, 84.8 applied. So Donovan's decision was an 84.8 decision. Then you had the decision in Richard Duncan, which is another pensions case. And in that case, Duncan was sent on leave. And even after his leave had expired, he remained home on further leave, but his leave had expired. And he's saying, listen, I have been effectively retired from the public service, and therefore I'm entitled to an 84.8 pension. And interestingly, in both Donovan and the Duncan cases, the High Court disagreed. And it went to appeal before the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal reversed in those two instances, both Donovan and Duncan. And then you had, thirdly, you had the Mcqueen case. And in Mcqueen case, his post in the Department of Labor Cooperatives, that was being abolished. And it was said in relation to Mcqueen, look, you have, unlike Duncan and Donovan, who came in pre-April 4th, 1983, and I'll come back to that, Mcqueen came post-April 4th, 1983. So it was said, listen, you have come post-April 4th, 1983, and therefore you are not entitled to what we generally call a 1958 pension, because the Pension Disqualification Act passed in September 1983 says the cutoff point was April 4th with the establishment of NIS, and therefore what you are entitled to is an NIS pension. And the argument then was, no, not an NIS pension, but I'm entitled, first of all, I've been effectively retired from the public service. And 84.8 also applies to me. And I also ought to be paid pursuant to 84.8. Now, in Mcqueen, which has been touted in this particular case, in Mcqueen, the then Chief Justice, and also I should say, Kellon, that Mcqueen also lost at first instance. And it was the appeal court that reversed the first instance ruling. And it was said that, listen, what 84.8 says is every person, effectively every person who is retired from the public service for the purpose of reorganization ought to be paid as if they had attained the age of 60 years. And therefore, the issue of the NIS, unlike Duncan and Donovan, the issue of the NIS and the Pension Disqualification Act were live issues in Mcqueen. And what Chief Justice Byron, as he then was at the Court of Appeal, said, listen, one, what the Pension Disqualification Act did is to disqualify persons entering the public service after April 4th, 1983, from receiving what I would just simply call a 1958 pension. And you would then qualify to receive an NIS pension. Because what Section 92 and 93, which are the live issues in this particular case, there are three sections of the Constitution that address pension, mainly 84.8, 92 and 93. This case introduced the issues of 92 and 93 for the first time head on. And what 92 says is that at the point that you enter the service, whatever pension you are entitled to, whether it's whatever pension is the pension law in force, you are guaranteed for the next 26 years of your employment to receive either that pension or a higher pension. You can't receive a lower pension. That is what Section 92 essentially says. And the argument about the Pension Disqualification Act, because I think it's important to understand that, is that the Disqualification Act in effect says, well, if you enter the service after April 4th, 1983, you are entitled, then NIS is in force, and you are entitled to an NIS pension. And permit me, Kelon, because I think that's an important issue here, because you made, for example, mention in your introduction that one of the important legacies of the PRG, in a sense, was struck a blow. And I beg to disagree with that, because one of the important legacies of the PRG is the NIS. And the NIS stands strong or stronger today than ever than it had been since 1983. And what the NIS sought to do is to ensure that there were benefits, including age benefits, for all workers, whether you are in the public service or not, and even if you are self-employed. So it provided for sickness, invalidity, age pensions, and so. And what the PRG also did, because you see, in the whole debate and how the debate is being conducted, it sounded as though the PRG wished to take away pensions from public workers and give them a different or lower pension. And nothing could be further from the truth, because first of all, the PRG in its People's Laws, number 9, within the first 2 weeks of the revolution, People's Law number 9 declared that all public servants' rights and pensions shall be preserved. 1. 2. Under the NIS Act, it provided for and contemplated that public officers entering the service will get a special pension. In other words, they won't just fall under the general NIS scheme. And there was a formula to do so. And that formula was contained in Section 47 of the NIS Act, which says, listen, the NIS is applicable to public officers. But what the minister had the power to do under Section 47 is to they had the power to modify the scheme and introduce a new scheme that will obviously take into account the peculiar situation with public officers. And that's where the problem lies. It was
not wanting to cut you, but are you hearing me there, Ruggles? I want to make sure.
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Yes, very well. In the judgments, it's interesting that the judge here, he said the conclusion of this matter is that the originating motion filed. No, I'm sorry. The national, he said, it is hereby ordered that the National Insurance Act, Cap 205, did not modify, wind up, or repeal the pension schemes for public officers contained on the pensions regulations. So I thought that point needs to be made as well. Please proceed.
Precisely. And that is what Chief Justice Byron said in Mcqueen, and that is what the learned judge repeated in this matter, because what the judge is simply saying, he's referring to, which was part of our submissions, he's referring to Section 47 of the Act. Section 46 of the NIS Act says, listen, pensions, public officers are included as part of NIS pensions. And the whatever scheme is in place for public officers, that would fall under NIS. So you'll have one entity managing schemes. But 47 went on to say that the minister now shall modify, wind up, or repeal the existing scheme, has the power to do so and replace it with another scheme. So by not doing so effectively, what the court is saying and what Mcqueen said, Chief Justice Byron, is that the legislative intent of the PRG was never brought into force or never continued. Because remember, the Pension Disqualification Act was in September 1983. The PRG collapsed in October 1983. And no governments
before, government
subsequent to that addressed 47 of the NIS Act at all, with the result being that the contemplation of that special pension scheme for public officers never came into force. So what the court is saying, if it was never repealed, then it means that it is still there because there was nothing to replace it. And therefore, the 58th pension scheme will continue so long as it has not been replaced. So that is the issue, and I think it's important because, of course, different people have different, understanding, and perspectives on it. But in it, the issue is lost as to what the PRG attempted to do, because all the PRG was doing was centralizing pensions under a separate entity, so it will not be just arbitrary. It will be centralized under the NIS, and it will be expanded to include all categories of workers. So nothing was done then in 83. And then now you find in the 90s, late 90s, in 2008, in fact, or 2007, you had the first set of retirees from there.
Yeah. I believe it's about 2007, 2008.
Yes, because you had the Herman Armstrong case.
Correct.
Then. So then everybody woke up. Hey, there's an issue here. And so it was never addressed before between 83 and 2008. That time, and therefore it led to this particular issue. But the historical facts and the role of the Constitution in terms of pensions and the role of the NIS in terms of pensions need to be understood in a discussion on this matter.
All right, thank you for that. And laying in wait here is Mr. Kenny James. Mr. James, you for many industrial relations disputes with the government of the day and with previous governments as well. And so the government indicated that there will be ongoing discussions and have invited your colleagues to the table. What do you hope comes out of these conversations, Mr. James?
Thank you, Kellon, and good morning to you. Good morning to the rest of the panel and also our viewers and listeners. It's always a pleasure to interact with you. And in this instance, to speak on what I would call a landmark victory, what I would call one of the most historic events for the working class in Grenada since the rise and fall of the Grenada Revolution. Now, as we explore this issue, because Ruggles went deeply into some of the considerations that we must understand and some of the things that are normally not discussed on this issue. As we go forward with it, and in specific reference to your question, one has to go back to 2018. In 2018, the unions, prior to the election, the general elections, the public sector unions engaged with government in discussions over the whole issue of pensions and gratuity. What happened? Coming out, our MOU was signed, firstly. And what you're not hearing is the fact that the MOU that was signed captured some of the main points of discussion on which there was general agreement. Because what you didn't want was to get into an election, the government changes, and then the new administration says to you, we have to start all over. So on some of the critical issues that there were general agreement on, an MOU was signed. The government subsequently took this MOU as a final document and decided that they were going to run with it. The labor unions realized, no, this can't happen. And you would recall now, in 2018, coming down to the latter part of the year, industrial action was taken, where we marched the streets and we protested for over a week. Our salaries were docked. Now, all of that happened, and that matter is also in court. Here we are today, where the decision was made by the court, because coming out of the 2018 discussions, the fact that government was saying one thing, we were saying another, the decision was taken by the leaders. Let us put this before the court. Let the court settle it once and for all. So the court has settled. The question now is, what are you going to discuss? The issue of trust. The fact that the 2018 went out the door and was treated in such a disrespectful manner, how do you today, as a trade unionist, say to your membership, you are going to sit with the same administration to discuss the issue of your pension and gratuity when the court has now ruled in your favor? What are you going to talk about? So I think this is one of the critical issues that we would see coming to the table. As a matter of fact, on Friday evening, we had a celebratory march through St. George's, which culminated with a nice little rally in Old Trafford. And
a reprimand from your paymasters at the Ministry of Education. Don't forget that, Mr. James.
and again, that goes to show also, Kellan, the heart of the administration's response to things. Because clearly, I saw published somewhere in social media the request, for example, made by the GUT. And the GUT indeed admitted that its application was late, but it came prior to the event. Now, what you got coming out of the Ministry of Education suggested that GUT asked for no permission at all. So that is another matter which speaks to the level of trust and which speaks to the openness to serious dialogue and discussion. And one has to ask himself, was this just a knee-jerk reaction because we're not happy with what has happened, and so we don't want you to celebrate? So again, all of these things now are in the water, and to some extent is muddying the water for union leaders to say to their membership that they're going to sit with the government to have discussions. And remember,
but Mr. James, I would push back there. The unions sat with the government and signed a memorandum of understanding, okay, with the current administration. And so for you to now say that you don't have faith in the administration, you did have faith when you signed that memorandum of understanding. What changed?
Kellan, you're correct. At that time, because the unions felt this matter must be addressed. So enter into discussions with the government. But the government turned and switched it up on the unions, as was indicated in the MOU. And so that trust, what we call good faith in negotiations, have been tarnished by the administration. So now it is more difficult, right? Remember, trade union organizations are governed by the membership at the top and the leadership at the bottom. It's put it this way, it's an upside down triangle. So the membership determines what the leadership is going to do. And the sentiments you're hearing out there now, since this judgment was handed down, is, I don't know what you're all going to talk to the government about. What government needs to say is how they intend to pay. So this is a situation that has been brought on, Kellan, in all honesty. If the government had held true to the discussions, and I am not just saying MOU, because I stand on the ground that the MOU captured broad areas for which we had agreement. And if you read it in totality, you would see that it speaks to the fact that other things needed to follow for these things to make sense. If the government, the administration at the time, had treated with this 2018 situation in a better manner, in a more honest manner, the matter would not have gone before the court. So we would not have had that judgment today. But God is God, and I guess he recognized that what was happening there was not of the best, and so it turned out how it turned out. And thank God, today you have a victory from the court.
All right, and you are preempting the other question that I have. I don't know if you saw my questions list here, but I want to bring in Miss Chantel McGuire. Miss McGuire, if you can unmute your mic, we understand that you can't turn your camera on, but we are glad to have you. And the question of how do you pay? I think Mr. James is trying to get a sense from the government how we are going to pay this. Now, you've worked previously and advised the government of Grenada. Now, how do you think this ruling would impact the current structure of retirement schemes that are administered by the state?
Okay, I assume you're referring to NIS.
Correct.
Exactly.
Yes.
I think this judgment is a big judgment, and it's a new it'll be a big administrative burden for NIS, but I think they are well equipped to handle it as they deal with all of the nation's social security. So they should have a lot of structures in place to administer these payments. I think the biggest issue is around the funding, right? The government needs to make big decisions as to where exactly they will accumulate. I hear 1 billion being thrown around the place. Like, how are they going to make those payments? Because you're not only thinking of a year of funding, no, we have to, like, I'm assuming, have a lot of retroactive payments. And so they need to figure out if that could be staggered. And this is what should have been, to me personally, come out through those conversations with the unions, as Mr. James suggested. Like, that to me was areas that there wasn't much clarity on in general what will be done in those regards when it comes from the government. But I would say that there's a lot of different ways you could fund it, right? And what you may have to do, especially for such a big burden, is maybe trying to find a way to do a one-time tax. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to NIS, you shouldn't be tapping into those funds that are for regular citizens and who have paid into the NIS funding. You should always have separate funds which are targeted at specific types of pension plans. So as a legislation, I hear you guys talk a lot with the lawyer earlier. They have to figure out exactly what methodology they would use to fund it. You could use taxes, you could use allocations. The budget would probably have to come into play here. It's a significant burden. And to me, NIS personally, administratively, they're well equipped to handle it, but just the funding approaches, they would have to hire a lot of expertise. They would have to hire actual expertise to decipher how to set up the fund and etc. And have a lot of risk controls in there to make sure that the government can continually be able to fund these payments. Because a lot of things, what happens is a great topic for today, but then going forward, we forget how to properly manage such a huge obligation going forward. So they would definitely need to figure out, a lot of risk controls to put in place. I mean, my personal thoughts is a hybrid approach will be best. And I mean, this is, I guess, taps into the design of the plans of the scheme. From my understanding, the gratuity payments is usually the biggest area of contention. So how are you going to pay that out? Is it going to be a stagger thing for the past? Or are you going to come to agreement with the unions? They may take a fraction. I don't know. But there's a lot of different ways this could be divvied up. And I do think a lot of modern approaches should be implemented as well. But the biggest burden to NIS, I really do think, is that they will have to hire the right expertise to really decide on how to fund this public state pension plan now.
Yeah, you mentioned modern approaches, and I want you to expand on that a bit. Are you referring to approaches that we see in North American models that include 401ks, 403bs, things like that?
Yes, I mean, and one of the questions you posed to me is what is my preferred approach, and I do
Hmm.
believe that a mix of these modern approach with possibly like a minimum payment requirement by the government is ideal. I understand that. To me, the government says a lot, and people talk a lot about this retirement scheme like it's a complex issue, and I agree with them 100%. It's very, very complex. So the burden with 401k and 403bs, even to understand that sometimes is complex, but I do believe that they give you more of a structure that you can manage the cost better. And the employees, if you do it in a transparent way, can see what they can retire with going forward. But I do believe as a government and as a state, and these are public servants, that they require like a minimum to go home with. Like there should
Hmm.
be no confusion around how much you're going to exactly go home with. But when it comes to the gratuity portion, I do believe that big lump sum that you take at the end of the year, if
Hmm.
you save that in like a 401k type plan, you probably would have got home with more than what the public service pension would have given you in a gratuity. But
Hmm.
but if you had like a 401k structure in place, if they did it from, I guess, from 85 or whatever, they would be going home with way more gratuity than it is there today. I just don't know how the government will go about funding that gratuity payment. For average person making $50,000, you're talking about over $100,000 they have to pay out a year they retire. So it's a lot of money for the government to pay, and that's for one person, right? $100,000 for one person. Can you imagine on average maybe 100 people retire a year?
Hmm.
It's a lot of money for the government to be paying on an ongoing basis in gratuity. But I do believe there's a way that they could go about it going forward. Like they have to take it in two approaches. How are they going to deal with the retroactive payments that are owed? And I guess they're still waiting for the language on the statement to figure out how much is exactly owed to these employees.
Hmm.
Then the second approach is yes, which is great and I think needed to be addressed and is a really good outcome of the ruling is the fact that it stated that you have to pay a public servant's pension. So now we're forced to articulate what going forward would look like for most public servants, right?
Hmm.
And that is a complex issue in itself and will require a lot of analysis and deep dive into ages of employees that we have, and a lot of actual work will go into that. But in essence, it needs to be addressed, and it's kind of like forcing us now to address this pension issue because nobody should really be going home with nothing after you spend your whole life working. And I do,
Right.
so it's
Hmm.
I'm really appreciative of that element forcing us to decide what our plan is going forward. And I do think it's a great opportunity to make sure that what we design going forward will help us manage social security with the times, as you say, bringing maybe a 401k element, because that would give you a lump sum payment when you retire, as well as it could be even greater than the gratuity payments. And all that burden is not on the government. It's just a set allocation that you put towards that. So they don't even need to think about how much they have to pay. Because that's usually be the hardest part of actuaries' work, right? Is that
Hmm.
you have to figure out how you're going to pay for this obligation of a lump sum payment. And if you use the 401k approach, it really simplifies how. It's however your money grows, that's how much you're going to take. But I do believe on an ongoing basis, as a citizen, you want to know how much money you'll be taking home every month, regardless in retirement, so you could plan financially for your retirement. So I really do think it's a hybrid approach. Don't give away completely all of the defined benefit elements, but it's a combination of bringing in the 401k type approach, but also having some minimum requirements as to how much people go home with. But that's
Let me Yeah, you said a lot, and I do not want to be in your shoes at the time if you were called upon to, but I'm sure you are built for this. That is your area of expertise. Mr. James, is there anything that the actuary articulated here that you wanted to respond to?
Yes, Kellon. Kellon, I hear Ms. Maguire, and she is correct if we are dealing, or when we look at pension reform and we get to the NIS having to handle this. And I want to go back to what Ruggles' contribution, because this is something I want everyone, all our viewers, to get clear. There are two separate quote-unquote pension schemes here. There's a pension scheme that the government of Grenada was supposed to have in place for its workers, the public worker. And there is the NIS, separate, apart. To understand it, if you're a public sector worker now in Grenada, the company with which you work have a pension plan. Plus, you are paying your NIS. When you leave that private sector entity, you go home with your NIS portion, your NIS contributions, and also you have access to whatever pension plan the company has or had in place for you. Our pension plan is the government of Grenada that was expected to have our pension plan in place in addition to the NIS, because government of Grenada in this context is an employer. So as it stands now, going back to what Ruggles was explaining, the NIS regulations, which came in under People's Law, suspension of constitution, put in place the NIS regulation because their intention, as Ruggles explained, was to give everybody a benefit. But sections 46 and 47 ensured that there was an understanding that there was a need for the government through the NIS then to develop the plan that was now going to substitute for government's pension. But that was never done. Why? As he explained, because in 1983, people to significantly benefit from this, section 46 or 47, as envisaged under the NIS regulation, that would have only started maybe in about 2003, 20 years after, if you were going to seriously benefit. So they placed the section and they left it. So today, without the fact that we are back on the Constitution, if you are going to implement 46 and 47, which was penned under the People's Law, you now need to look at what the Constitution says about the public workers' pension and see how you are going to apply it in 46 and 47 of the NIS regulations. So it is not as simple as saying, right now, the NIS, based on this judgment, is made more secure. Why is it made more secure? Because the public officer who is sick and keep going to work because he cannot retire because he knows he's not getting anything. Because right now, NIS only kicks in at 60. So if you're 50, 55, and you're terminally ill, you have to take your walking stick, send in how much sick leave, which is a burden on NIS, until you get to 60. Buy time until you get to 60. What this ruling has done is indicated that as the employer, consider how much years this person has spent with you, you give them what you are obligated to give them, and then they can go home and wait for the NIS to kick in. Less sick leaves. That's one. Two, this ruling, when implemented, is going to open up the door to solving or assisting in solving the issues of the permanent employment and how we treat with contract work in the government service. Because there are people who can leave and open up spaces that younger people could have permanent employment. The regulation of public officers is another thing. So apart from looking at just the financial implications going forward of the judgment, we have to look at the opportunities that would be created for further development of the country. And I would add, Keller, the structure of our society, all things being equal, says to us that the middle class
is supposed or expected to take care of the lower class. What is happening in Grenada is that we are destroying the middle class. The nurses, the teachers, the lawyers, the doctors. We are impoverishing this group of people and then making the people at the bottom feel that government must feed you and creating a dependency syndrome. Now, if you empower your middle class in the society, what happens is that the nurse now doesn't have time to come home and cook. She hires somebody to cook for her. She hires somebody to wash. And so you have that trickle-down economics. When the public officer gets some money to go home, he or she now can pay off a mortgage, send his or her child to university, or even create a small business that generates employment for those at the lower strata of the society. So there's much more to be gained from a judgment like this if it's implemented than just simply, because that's a line that government is pushing. It's so expensive. And everybody is being blindsided by the fact that there's a lot of money. We agree, it's money. And as a country, we've done well to deal with all our financial issues over the years. And this one is no exception. Because on this one, what we have to remember, this one is for us. This one is not paying IMF or World Bank or some foreign country. But this money, this pension money, whatever goes into pension, is a benefit for the Grenadian society and the Grenadian people. And that is what every one of us, as a Grenadian people, have to understand and appreciate.
All right. Anything you wanted to add to what was said here, Ruggles? Before we take a break, we have to come up for air, and then we'll come back for some closing comments from all of you.
Okay, well, I'll reserve it for the closing comments. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Folks, stay with us. This was a very enlightening and educational panel. I believe Mr. Ferguson was able to really distill and educate our viewers and listeners with respect to what the judgment meant, the implications, in addition to Ms. Maguire distilling the financial implications of this decision. So stay with us, folks. We'll take a quick break, and we will be right back. Why would we have ambassadors representing the state that do not understand clearly what their terms of reference are?
These are the cards that I have drawn, that I am the minister at this point in time. And for members of the public...
But you're also a servant of the people. The unions are not threatening to withdraw their labor, and neither are they threatening to shut the country down, as you did.
I think your summarization of my position is highly inaccurate, and may I dare say a bit inflammatory.
The strategy did not work the last time for you. So what would make this?
Well, you're assuming that we're doing the same strategy.
And welcome back, folks. At this time, I wish to give our guests an opportunity to offer some closing comments. Some very important perspectives were advanced here this morning and into the afternoon, and we thank our panelists for providing that. As a reminder, we did invite a government representative to appear on the program, and we believe that one would be subsequently appearing. We also invited a former trade unionist, current president of the Senate, Senator Chester Humphrey, to appear on the program, but he did not respond to our requests. So that attempt was made. But at this time, I want to give our guests an opportunity to offer some closing comments. So, Ms. Maguire, I would begin with you.
Okay, thank you, Kalan. So I guess my closing remarks is to fund this. I know, as both panelists have articulated very well, the need for this ruling, and basically just a need to clarify the benefits to public servants. I totally agree. It's needed. The retirement scheme, what they walk home with today, it's really minuscule and it needs to be addressed. All I have to say is that the funding needs to be done very well, because you don't want to get yourself in a situation that you're paying for a subset of the population that and you cannot fund it. So it's really getting those numbers fully articulated, I think, is key. And also looking, I know I didn't mention this as much before, but looking at the plan features. That is also key in making sure that this pension for public servants is sustainable and it will be well managed in the future. So basically, a lot of people under the old scheme could have retired earlier, like by 50. They kind of was forcing you to get locked into a job, like you couldn't move in and move out. Those are features that in today's world, there's so much value with people moving around for their jobs. And, you being forced to stay in a job just so that you could get a sufficient pension, I don't think serves the government, serves the worker, or anybody in society. So these type of plan features, I do think is one thing I didn't touch on that would also need to be addressed. And
Talk to. I'm also a layman with respect to finance. When you say plan features, can you flesh that out for us?
Sure. So anybody who works in the private sector, they all have, most of them have pension plans that the employer gives you. Like Mr. James was just speaking to that earlier. So, and then the government now, this public plan is basically the plan that they would give to all employees. So this plan has different features in it. From my understanding, under the old scheme, if this is what has to be implemented today, a lot of employees, different service groups and different unions, I think they all have different requirements as to how much they go home with. And some of it is basically you could leave at 50 and get your full pension. So those type of features today with people living longer are very burdensome on pension plans. So those type of features would need to be addressed. See if that's something you really want to make sure any and everybody are able to do in the public service. For instance, so the age requirement is also 60. Like NIS is moving up to 65. They may have to change that as well with the public service, make it consistent with NIS. And then just to me, another major issue is the lock. So the employee lock. So if you have to spend like 20 years continuous service, I believe, to get a full pension. So to me, if you work for government the majority of your career, maybe it adds up to 20, but you wouldn't get it unless it's continuous service. I believe there's certain stipulations in there. Like these type of features and details need to be fine-tuned. And I do believe needs to be in accordance with what the government wants for its workers. So these are the type of nitty-gritty plan details you have to figure out while you're doing funding as well, because these features will impact the type of funding that you choose. So all these things all together needs to be reassessed, and I really hope that what they do come up with in the end will be something that really capitalizes on not just a pay-as-you-go system as the current NIS is doing, but could bring in more modern techniques to make sure that pension is well funded and well managed going forward.
Thank you for that. Ruggles.
Okay, thank you, Kellon. Yes. In all the discussion, apart from the immediate issues, one must never forget the importance of the Constitution in all of this. In fact, the Constitution over the last maybe 5-6 years in particular have come under scrutiny. It's important to understand the role of the Constitution, and in this case, the role of the Constitution with respect to pensions, as I mentioned before, 84-8, 92, and 93, and how our laws, such as the NIS, dovetail with all of this. I believe what the PRG intended to do was to let the NIS manage all pensions for workers, but it is clear, I believe, from the sections 46 and 47 of the NIS Act, which seems to have been overlooked over the years, that the intention was to have a separate pension scheme for public officers. And as Kenny indicated, you can have any number of pension schemes. It is not a contradiction. For example, an employer may have a separate pension scheme, totally separate and apart from NIS or any other pension schemes. You can have 4 or 5 pension schemes running side by side. And in this case, the contention is that the NIS is a contributory scheme, which is with both employer and employee contributing towards that scheme. And you also have the what we contend to be the Section 92 pensions, in a sense, associated with public officers. And that pension is different in a sense from the NIS scheme. However, NIS can incorporate it for the purpose of management and administration, because you have the employer also making contributions to the NIS, and the mechanics of that can be worked out. But as the expert indicated here, that all of these things have to be addressed, have to be planned properly, because it has serious impact. And remember, it's a government responsibility. And when we say government here, is no particular government, it's any government that is in power at the time. It is a responsibility that falls squarely on its shoulders, and therefore it has to make provision for these things. And no doubt this judgment has significant impact on the parties, on the economy, and it is something that ought to be addressed accordingly.
And you make a very good point there. Because government is a continuum, regardless of which administration is in office at the time, and they would obviously have to address that issue.
Precisely. Any government, it's a continuum,
yeah.
And therefore, whichever party forms the government, it is a responsibility that falls smack within the list of responsibilities. And again, because it involves a certain category of worker, that's your public worker, your administrative arm of the state, in a sense, it assumes even greater importance.
Absolutely. Ruggles, thank you so much. You actually went down to your office this morning. I didn't even know that you were doing that. So I thank you for your dedication to this cause, and of course to all of the other attorneys. On a personal note, my grandmother worked at the General Post Office, as it was known back then, as an office attendant. She was an office attendant, and I do remember my grandmother, that's my paternal grandmother from Gorv, the late Wilfina Williams, and I do remember her having diabetes and her having to struggle, and the anxieties that she started to have when the time came for her to retire, and the concerns about how to buy her medication, concerns about how she will take care of herself without a pension. The NIS funds, obviously, it was helpful, but it did not go as far. And so for me personally, this judgment hit a particular nerve, and I'm not going to get emotional, because I also want to thank the Technical and Allied Workers Union on behalf of my grandmother, who supported her in some of her most difficult days. So this judgment, sorry for getting emotional, but it also impacted me personally, because I saw that struggle of my late grandmother. Mr. James.
Kellon, you're correct. Now you're getting emotional, and my eyes are being filled with water, because you're correct. And I want to thank you for engaging in this discussion and for helping us to dispel some of the noise, to quiet some of the noise that has been made over and over and over on this issue of pensions to mislead. Kelon, there is no public servant pension in existence. I could tell you that. Efforts have been made to piggyback off NIS. But in the true sense, the government of Grenada has not yet owned its liability to its workers. And I want our viewing audience and public to get this straight. Government of Grenada, to date, even in lieu of the judgment, has not owned its liability to its workers. And while you may not understand the intricacies of how the public sector pensions work, the best way to understand it is this. Whoever you are working with today, there's a benefit that you get for your years of service with that company. In Grenada, those of us who work with government, there's absolutely no benefit that the government of Grenada is giving to us for our 20 years, 26 years, 34 years of service. This is the harsh reality, comrades. Comrades, this is not about politics. This is not about NDC or NNP or which administration didn't touch it. The fact is, we are in a state where our politicians accept to take for themselves a pension after 4, sometimes 8 years of service, and the people who work in the trenches to ensure that they as politicians look good, to ensure that the country looks good, to ensure that the speeches are written properly, to ensure that the policy directives that are issued, that they roll out smoothly, the public officers to teach the nation's children. We are not getting anything for 10, 20 or so years going, but they could spend a minimum of 8 years and receive. That is not acceptable. And so it has nothing to do with green, yellow, pink. It has to do with the fact that this matter must be resolved. And I want us to please look, if you're a worker, look at your pension law. Because a part of the noise is giving the public the impression that every public officer is pensionable. Everybody who works with government is not pensionable like that. There are different permutations within the service that you're not hearing about because it's good PR for the other side to say everybody. Not every public officer is pensionable, but how would you know? Go to your Pension Act. So if you're a prison officer, go to the Prison Officers Act. As a police officer, go to the Police Officers Act. Go to the Public Officers Act. Go to the Pension School Teachers Act. And there you would see how it is broken down for your specific area of service in the public service. This is an ongoing discussion. We know that we're going to have to dig deep to come up with the approach to meeting the liability. But I am hoping that our politicians would own the liability and that we can then work together as a country, as a society, to push this thing forward. What you hear most, Kelon, finally, what you hear most is about the inefficiencies that you see in the public service. It happens in the private sector, but they don't talk about it. But everybody is big on talking about the issues of productivity and the lack of productivity in the service. Well, here's what. When you provide...
But Mr. James, isn't that a valid argument?
It is, but it should not be the argument that is used to disenfranchise those who are working and working hard from getting the benefit that they justly deserve, like your grandmother, Keller. And so let's continue this conversation. Again, thank you very much for having me and for dealing with the tough issues. I think you've developed a reputation for dealing with the tough issues and having them discussed publicly. Thank you very much, my brother. I wish you all the best, and let's continue to work together to keep Grenada strong.
Absolutely, Mr. James. As a programming note, viewers and listeners, there will be a part 2 to this program next week. We are hoping to gather a second panel. Hopefully, we would be able to have a government representative for that second panel. That would include an economics take on this issue, because we believe one program is not enough to flesh out this issue. We're talking about a significant price tag, but the context here is that this issue has been a perennial one from the time Grenada returned to democratic rule in 1984. So this is not an issue that has happened today. We have gotten to that point after a series of litigations, after a series of conversations that have not really dealt with the issue head on. So we will be having a part 2 next week, so please stay tuned for that. And on behalf of the viewers and listeners, I wish to, on behalf of the producers of the program, rather, I wish to thank all of you for your participation today. We went almost 2 hours in, but we believe that this conversation needed to happen. On behalf of the hardworking producers, I thank you again for watching the Bubb Report this week, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.